Paper 2, Muscle Growth Causes Muscle Loss by Van Vossel and colleagues, a paper recently published in Medicine and Science in Sport and Exercise. An interesting paper was published recently exploring the idea of muscle reallocation. For example, does bicep growth come at the cost of tricep muscle size? This is an idea that our research group at the University of Mississippi pondered back in 2016. We observed that a group of non-resistance trained individuals who completed 6 weeks of traditional bicep curl training experienced noticeable muscle growth in their biceps. However, during this period, we also observed a slight decrease in the triceps muscle size, indicating a potential trade-off. We thought that this change may have been a measurement error. However, we didn't observe a change in our control muscle group of the lower body or our other training condition, which was a no-load training condition. So we speculated that the change could be real. The idea of muscle reallocation also made some sense from a stress perspective. For example, amongst many of his theories, Hans Selye, an endocrinologist who is best known for developing the concept of the general adaptation syndrome, speculated that all adaptation comes at a cost, and that we only adapt to so much stress at any given time. Selye credited this to the concept of adaptation energy, which has never been proven. That said, another potential rationale to explain this phenomena of muscle reallocation may be related to energy availability and demand. Van Vossel et al. Explains that the energetic cost to acquire 1 kilogram of skeletal muscle tissue is estimated to be around 6,700 kcals. The authors also explain that increasing muscle protein synthesis from training increases metabolic rate, and that the acquisition of new muscle tissue also increases metabolic rate. Given the demands of muscle hypertrophy, the authors speculate that other muscles may atrophy to, quote, reserve and secure the required energy and amino acids for hypertrophy of the recruited muscles. Of course, the loss of muscle in untrained muscles would not be a desirable adaptation for most individuals, making this a very interesting and worthwhile topic of exploration. The purpose of this manuscript was to investigate muscle growth adaptations in 28 lower body muscles, both those trained and those not trained, and 2 upper body muscles following 10 weeks of resistance training. Methods. What did the authors do? 21 non-resistance trained men and women were recruited for this study. Measurements of body mass, body fat percentage, estimated via skin fold, and calculated fat-free mass estimated from subtracting fat mass from total mass were taken at baseline, 3 weeks, and 6 weeks following the training program. The program is detailed in Table 2.1 below. In addition to this, muscle volume was measured using magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, in order to investigate muscle growth adaptations across the training periods, also detailed below. Training protocol. As described earlier, the authors employed a 10-week resistance training program. The present study was part of a larger project examining the influence on training frequency on muscle growth adaptations. Therefore, participants performed training 2 times a week in one arm and one leg, and performed training 3 times a week in the other arm and the other leg. During each training session, participants performed 3 to 4 sets per exercise, training to failure with a load estimated around 60% of the participants' 1RM. Participants were allowed 120 seconds rest between exercise sets and 3 minutes of rest between exercises. The resistance training program exercises are provided in Table 2.1 below. A quick look at Table 2.1, and you will note that participants performed bicep curls and lying tricep extensions in the upper body. In the lower body, participants performed leg extension and seated leg curl exercise. Muscle volume. Muscle volume was measured using MRI. Muscle volume of several different muscles were measured. For analytical purposes, the right and left sides were summed for each muscle of interest. Each muscle or muscle group is labeled as a, quote, primary recruited muscle, defined as primary targeted muscles of one of the exercises, a secondary recruited muscle, defined as muscles receiving concurrent training stimuli during an exercise, or a, quote, non-recruited muscle, muscles that had no function in the exercise program. A look at Table 2.2 below provides the muscles included in the present study along with their classification. Please see Table 2.2 for the full list of muscles investigated and what their classification was according to the authors. Nutrition. For the duration of the study period, participants were asked to maintain their diet. To help with protein intake, participants were provided a whey protein shake containing 0.3 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass following their training sessions. For example, a 65 kilogram participant would receive a shake containing 19.5 grams of protein. Participants completed a self-reported dietary questionnaire at baseline, 3 weeks, and 6 weeks. Based on the results from the survey, participants were retrospectively divided into a high energy intake group, a low energy intake group, for some additional analysis. Specifically, authors wanted to examine if potential muscle loss was different between individuals who had lower and higher energy intakes. Results. What did the authors find? Following the training periods, the authors found that all primary and secondary muscle groups increased in muscle size. Two of the muscles that weren't specifically targeted, the soleus and the adductor magnus, experienced significant muscle loss during the training period, with reductions of negative 2.4 and negative 1.5% respectively. Changes in muscle volume were not different between males and females, with the exception of the vastus intermedius, which is one of the muscles of the thigh. In their follow-up analysis, the authors found that there was a positive relationship between daily protein intake and net muscle growth, but not between net energy intake and net muscle growth. For the non-active muscles, the authors found that there was a significant correlation between total volume and daily energy intake, but not with total daily protein intake. Positive correlations were also observed between mean daily energy intake and changes in the soleus, the adductor magnus, and the adductor longus muscle volume. So what does this data mean for me? How can I use the information in this paper? This was a pretty interesting study. In the discussion, the authors summarize their findings as follows. Quote, the main findings of the current study are that during a single joint chronic resistance training period in which the upper arm and upper leg musculature were targeted, all recruited muscles increased in volume, while simultaneously some non-recruited muscles show significant muscle atrophy. This muscle atrophy was most pronounced in subjects with limited energy and protein availability. If the authors are correct, this may mean that untrained muscles may be at risk for muscle loss, especially if the diet is lacking in both protein and energy, and there are other demands for muscle growth. However, in the context of the present study, it's important to consider that 14 non-active muscles were measured, and only 2 of those muscles showed a decrease. In addition, these decreases were quite small, 2.4% for the soleus and 1.5% for the adductor magnus. Without control groups, which is a group that didn't train, for all the muscles in this study, it's difficult to discern if these changes are meaningful or simply measurement error. It should be noted that it's not uncommon to observe small changes in the size of a control muscle, which helps to understand if the changes in the intervention groups are meaningful. It is also important to note that some muscles are simply more difficult to measure than others. For these muscles, you would typically need a larger change in muscle size to have confidence that the change is real. Our lab doesn't have experience with the soleus and adductor magnus, so we can't speak specifically to the difficulty of measuring these muscles. With the study design employed, it's extremely difficult to conclude that 1, the soleus and adductor magnus actually decrease meaningfully, and 2, that the decrease in the soleus and adductor magnus was related to the muscle growth observed in the other muscles. Findings such as these are very interesting and should certainly drive curiosity. More than anything, these findings should fuel more research, but on their own, they don't provide strong evidence for muscle reallocation. From our perspective, this concept is more plausible in trained individuals who cease training muscles specifically. For instance, consider someone who has developed significant muscle hypertrophy in their quadriceps, but then stops training their quads and focuses solely on their hamstrings. In such a scenario, it seems quite likely that the quadricep might experience atrophy due to lack of stimulation. However, this phenomena would more closely relate to the adaptation not being maintained due to a lack of stimulation, rather than a necessity for energy availability requiring the breakdown of other muscle groups. Key takeaway points. First, non-trained muscle groups may atrophy when training other muscles during a period of low energy availability. Second, 2 out of 14 muscles not trained showed decreases in muscle size. However, these changes were quite small, 1.5% and 2.4%. And third, future research is necessary to better understand if muscle reallocation actually takes place in response to resistance training.